Hey guys, going to move on to another topic. We're going to go back and look at the production possibility curve and start to look at trade. All right, so topic is comparative advantage. So let's move on. So our example will be two countries, the US and Japan, two goods, computers and wheat, one resource, labor, and we're going to measure the labor in hours. All right, we will look at how much of both goods each country produces and consumes. We'll look at that if the country chooses to be self-sufficient, if it trades with the other country. All right, so we're going to look at the production possibility in the U.S. The U.S. excuse me, the U.S. has 50,000 hours of labor available for production per month. Producing one computer requires 100 hours of labor. Producing 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours of labor. So we'll draw the U.S. production possibility curve. We can get either 500 computers or 5,000 tons of wheat. Connect them, and there's your line. It is a linear line, which means the opportunity cost is constant, because obviously if you're a farmer, you know how to build computers, right? So we'll let that little thing slide with this graph, but so there's your PPC for the U.S., and this is without trade. This is them on their own. Okay, suppose the U.S. uses half its labor to produce each of the two goods, then it's going to produce 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. Okay, we just picked those numbers randomly, but it could be any point on the PPC curve, right? So this point is as good as the 0 and 5,000 or the 0 and 500, depending on what the U.S. society wants, whether they want more wheat or they want more computers. Okay, let's look at the production possibilities in Japan. Japan has 30 hours of labor available for production per month. Producing one computer requires 125 hours of labor. Producing 1 ton of wheat requires 25 hours of labor. Right? So every time you produce one computer, how many tons of wheat are you giving up to produce that 1 ton, that one computer? Okay, let me go to Japan's. They can do 240 or they can do 1,200. All right, let's say they decide to use half its labor, produce each good, and then it's going to produce 120 computers, 600 tons of wheat. Okay, let's look at consumption without trade. Without trade, U.S. consumers get 250 computers, 2,500 tons of wheat. The Japanese consumers get 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. Okay, now we compare consumption without trade to, let's look at it with trade. First, we need to see how many of each good is produced and traded by the two countries. So, suppose the U.S. produces 3,400 tons of wheat. How many computers would the U.S. be able to produce with its remaining labor? $3,400 tons of wheat requires 34,000 labor hours. Which leaves them with 16,000 hours, and that would get them 160 computers. And this would, let's just go back there for a second. So this would be the point on the curve, right? This is the new point on the curve. Before we were down here somewhere, but here's our new point. Okay, and this is just a point on the curve. Suppose Japan produces 240 computers. How many tons of wheat would Japan be able to produce with its remaining labor? And the answer is 0. They would use all 30,000 hours to produce the 240 computers. Right? So we have that information, and we're going to look at exporting and importing. Right? So exports are goods produced domestically and sold abroad. So when a country is said to export, means to sell domestically produced goods abroad. Imports are goods produced abroad and sold domestically. Right? To import means to purchase goods produced in other countries. So let's look at the U.S. and Japan and talk about, suppose the U.S. exports 700 tons of wheat to Japan and imports 110 computers from Japan. right? So what that means is the Japanese are importing 700 tons and exporting 110 computers. So now how much of each good is consumed in the U.S.? So let's make a quick chart. We have produced 160 computers, 3,400 tons of wheat. We're going to import 110 computers. Okay, we're not importing any wheat. We're exporting those 700 tons of wheat, which is going to give us 270 computers and 2,700 tons of wheat. If you remember, we were at 250 and 2,500. Now look where we are. The point is outside the curve. We are able to get more by trading. We're pushing our PPC curve outwards because of trade. Okay, so it worked for the U.S. They benefited. Let's look at what happens with the Japanese. How much of each good is consumed in Japan? So they had 240 zero wheat. They got 700 wheat from us, but it cost them 110 computers. Okay, they have 130 computers, 700 tons of wheat, which was more, again, for them also. So both countries in this case are benefiting from trade, right? If they specialize in producing what they do better, both countries are better off. Okay, so we look at this. The gain from trade from the U.S. was 20 computers and 200 tons of wheat. For the Japanese, it was 10 computers and 100 tons of wheat. So both countries are better off. Where do these gains come from? Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is what's called absolute advantage. This is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. Whoever is better at producing the good has the absolute advantage. So the U.S. has an absolute advantage in wheat, producing a ton of wheat using 10 labor hours in the U.S. versus 25 in Japan. All right? If each country has an absolute advantage in one good, they specialize in that good and they can gain from trade. All right? Which country has an absolute advantage in computers? Producing one computer requires 125 hours in Japan, but only 100 hours in the U.S. Therefore, the U.S. has the absolute advantage in both goods. Okay, so when you see that, you would think to yourself, what's the point of trading with Japan when the U.S. is better at wheat and better at computers? Right? But that's the thing. We're not looking at absolute advantage. We want to look at a thing called comparative advantage. Okay? So two countries can gain from trade when each specializes in good it produces at a lowest cost. And that's what absolute advantage measures the cost of a good in terms of inputs. Right? So absolute advantage says, what did it cost us to make it? But we know in economics, we want to look at opportunity cost. How many computers did you give up to do a ton of wheat? How much wheat did you give up to build a computer? And that's what we're going to look at. Okay? In our example, the opportunity cost of computers, amount of wheat. All right? So opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability to produce the good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. So let's look at comparative advantage. Which country has the comparative advantage in computers? To answer this, we must determine the opportunity cost of a computer in each country. The opportunity cost of a computer, so every computer costs 10 tons of wheat in the U.S. because producing one computer requires 100 labor hours, which instead could produce 10 tons of wheat. Okay? 5 tons of wheat in Japan, because producing one computer requires 125 labor hours, which instead could produce 5 tons of wheat. So Japan has the comparative advantage in computers, right? So what's the opportunity cost of a ton of wheat in the U.S. and Japan? All right, so we want to look at the advantages. Gains from trades arise from comparative advantage. When each country specializes in a good, the pie, right? We talk about this a lot, is the size of a pie, the economic pie. How do you make the pie bigger? Or are you just changing the dimension, the amounts of the pie that each one gets. So the comparative, the line, your production possibility curve line, is your pie. How do you make that bigger? How do you push that out and get more of both goods for both countries? All right, and the way you do that is you specialize, both countries specialize, and by specializing they can then trade and have more of both goods. Right? Also, if you trade like this, you're less likely to get into conflicts because you're more dependent on each other. All right? Some unanswered questions here. We make a lot of assumptions about the goods and quantities of each good and prices. The real world, these quantities and prices be determined by the preference of consumers and the technology and resources in both countries. For now, though, our goal was merely to see how trade can make everyone better off. All right? And that's it for today. I'm sure you guys are missing the music, but can't be getting hit up for copyright.